Chapter 22. Steve sat on the bench under the kitchen window, as he did almost every afternoon, a handful of acorns in one hand. He dropped them one at a time in his right hand and sat very still. He waited while the squirrel he'd been taming for the last several weeks came up and took the seed. As the squirrel scampered away with his prize, Steve dropped another acorn into his hand and waited. He'd been sitting there about 15 minutes when halfway across the yard, the animal dropped his nut. He scurried back to get it, and Steve heard a soft tinkling laugh through the window above him. He knew it had to be Jade, though it wasn't the same laugh she'd had as a child. She and Rebecca were the only ones in the house, and he knew Rebecca's laugh. That wasn't it. The sound stirred something deep inside he hadn't been aware still existed. He resisted the urge to stand and look at her. Instead, he forced himself to stay where he was and finish feeding the animal. It wasn't until the little guy took the last acorn and skittered his furry butt home that Steve stood and turned. He met Jade's gaze. The happy smile she wore made his heart skip a beat and his jeans tighten. As she sobered and the smile faded, he realized he wanted to see it again. More so, he wanted to be the one to put it back. He gave her what he hoped was a pleasant smile, and went inside to warm up. He'd been out in the cold long enough, his nose had gone numb. He pulled off his jacket and scarf, and hung them both on the hooks beside the door. After kicking off his snow-caked boots, he went into the kitchen for a cup of coffee. "Were you feeding him?" Jade asked. Steve answered as he cupped both hands around his mug, letting the warmth seep into them. "Are all the animals around here so tame?" Jade's eyes were wide. "No, I've been working on him a while to get that. I started out leaving a small pile on the edge of the porch while I sat there. He had to brave getting close to get the treat. Each day I moved it a little closer, until I could hold him and he'd snatch him out of my hands. Eventually, I won't have to be so still, he'll just come take them." "That's amazing. It just takes patience." "But why most people wouldn't bother?" "It amuses me." He shrugged. "It started out as something to do while I kept close to the house one afternoon. But it wasn't just once, you keep doing it. You've put a lot of time into taming that squirrel." He shrugged again, and looked away, not really knowing what to say. "You hungry? You offering to cook for me? I thought something hot might help warm you up." "It would. What do you have in mind?" "I don't know, there's a lot of leftovers from yesterday in the fridge. What do you want?" "What would be nice to warm people up in this weather would be some turkey soup. Have you ever made it?" She scowled. "No, but I'm willing to learn." He stood. "I'll show you. Get out the turkey and the veggie tray from yesterday. We'll start there." He pulled the biggest pot Rebecca had from under the kitchen island. "First we bone out the turkey. Make 2 plates of meat, one dark, one light, and drop the bones in the pot." "Are you sure Rebecca won't mind us using things up like this? What if she has plans for something else? She's been the one to make it the last couple of years. We're just saving her some work." He glanced around. "Where is she?" "She wasn't feeling well, so she went to lie down for a while." "Let me go check on her, then I'll help with this." He left her to get started, and headed down the short hall to the Con and Karen's bedroom. Knocking on the open door, he peeked inside. "Are you all right?" She rolled over and looked at him. "I'm fine, my stomach's bothering me a little, that's all." She laid one hand low on her abdomen. "You're sure it's nothing to be concerned about? Want me to call Nick?" She shook her head. "It's nothing to worry about. Don't bother him." "You're sure?" "I am. Jade and I are putting together turkey soup. Do you want me to check in when it's done? See if you want some? If I'm not feeling better by then, that would be great." All right, call if you need anything. That's what JV said. She smiled. I will. He watched her a moment longer, then went back to the kitchen. Nick came in and looked around the kitchen. Steve and Jade sat playing cards while they waited for the broth to cook. Where's Rebecca? In the bedroom. She's not feeling well, Steve said as he dealt another hand of gin. What? Why didn't you call me? His eyes widened and he headed for the back of the house. She said not to bother you, she was all right, Steve called after him. Nick didn't say anything as he disappeared down the hall. Maybe we should have called him, Jade said, looking after Nick instead of at her cards. It'll be fine. Steve suspected he knew what was wrong with Rebecca's stomach, but he wasn't going to say anything, not yet. Jade looked at her cards and started rearranging them. How much longer do you think the soup will take? Not long now, we're just waiting for the carrots to cook, then we'll divide it up and add noodles to what we'll eat today. She frowned. Why not add the noodles first? They don't store well. As the soup freezes and thaws, the noodles absorb all the extra water, and then they're just mush. It works better to wait to add them. She nodded her agreement, then she picked up the top card from the discard pile and put down one out of her hand. They kept playing until Nick returned, Rebecca with him. How much longer until that soup's ready? Rebecca asked, rubbing one hand over her belly. Steve turned to Rebecca. Give it another 10 minutes and you can have some. That sounds great, Rebecca said, turning back to the table. What are you playing? Gin, Jade said. It's too cold to go outside, and I didn't want to leave you, in case you needed something. Plus, this way we could keep an eye on the soup. I hope you don't mind, Steve told me where to find the cards. Rebecca smiled. Not at all. I told you to make yourself at home. I just thought we all could play. Steve looked at Jade and shrugged, letting her know he didn't care, it was up to her. Sure, she said, or we can play something else, it's up to you. She frowned. Where's Matt? She turned to Nick. I thought he was with you helping feed. He was, but before we headed back to the house, he said he had something he had to do in town, and he left. She blinked. I didn't hear a car. I wasn't sure what the road's like, so I sent him in one of the ranch trucks. He left from the barn and took the other road. Jade went back to the table and started gathering cards. Do we want to play gin or something else? Gin or rummy is good with me, then when Matt gets back we can just deal him in if he wants to play. If we're playing pinochle it's not that simple, Rebecca said. Steve moved to the cabinet. Who's gonna want soup? He pulled out enough bowls for everyone and took them to the stove, stirring the pot while he was there. Go ahead and deal, I'll take care of this and we can play while we eat. They joked and laughed until they heard a vehicle pull into the yard. Thinking it was Matt, they continued until someone knocked on the door. When Steve went to the door, he was happy to discover it was Walt, the local UPS driver. Thanks, Steve said. Be careful, it's icy out there. Will do, Walt replied. Have a good weekend. You too. Steve glanced at the address on the box and knew what was inside. He took it with him into the kitchen. He kept his face carefully blank as he handed the box to Jade. It's for you. She frowned. For me? It's got your name on it. Her frown deepened. I didn't order anything. How can it be for me? Why don't you open it and find out, Steve suggested. She frowned, then cut open the top of the box. Pulling out the puffy coat inside, she looked at it a moment, then at the people around her. A coat. I know I needed one, but I didn't order it. Did you? She looked at Rebecca. Not me, the other woman said, but it matches your eyes perfectly. I didn't do it, Nick said. He looked like she shouldn't need to ask. She turned back to Steve, confusion filling her eyes. Did you? You needed a coat, he shrugged. I was worried about you wandering around in the snow without one. That's sweet. She put it back in the box and set it aside as she stood. Thank you, she stretched up and kissed him on the cheek. He looked down into her smiling face. The smile sent a sense of peace through him. The knowledge he had put it there stirred him. You're welcome, he bent and laid a light kiss against her mouth. Her taste distracted him. He coaxed her mouth open and drew her closer against him. The sound of Nick clearing his throat drew Steve back to his senses. He broke away and gently set Jade back on her feet. Come on, let's play. He steered her toward her seat and went back to his. Rummy, he asked, picking up the deck. That's what we settled on, Rebecca said, a spoon of soup halfway to her mouth. He started dealing. They were well into the second game when they heard another truck pull into the yard. Continuing to play, they waited to see who would come in. 2 brief knocks sounded, then the door opened. Hello, Matt's voice called. Anyone in here? We're in the kitchen, Matt, come on back, Nick said. Matt appeared in the doorway. What are you guys up to? Playing rummy, wanna join in? Steve offered. Maybe in a bit. I have some things I need to take to my room first. I just wanted to check in before I went out there. There's some turkey soup on the stove too, if you're interested, Rebecca said. I'd like some, but after I finish. I'll be back in a bit. Steve didn't bother looking up from his cards. He picked up half the discard pile and started making plays. We'll be here. They continued to play, and Steve was in the lead by more than 100 points when Matt came back. He came into the kitchen, twitching as a shiver ran through him. I'm ready for some of that soup now, if it's still hot, he said. If it's not, I'll heat it up. Jade went to the stove and pressed one hand against the side of the pot. It's warm, it'll only take a few minutes. After turning on the burner, she pulled out a bowl. Anyone else want some? I'll have some, Rebecca said. No thanks, said Nick. I'm good, was Steve's reply. She grabbed another, left the pair of bowls beside the stove, and went back to the table. I think Steve's about won this game. Want us to deal you in for the next one? She asked Matt as she gathered up glasses and took them to the island to be refilled. Sure, if no one minds, he said. The more the merrier, Rebecca smiled, happy. There's another chair in the mudroom, Steve told him, scooting his chair toward Jade's to make room for him to add a seat. While Jade filled drinks and served soup, he got the chair and put it in the opening between Steve and Nick. Jade set one bowl of soup in front of him, then moved around to give Rebecca the other before going back to her own seat. Who deals first? She asked. I will. Steve took the deck and quickly shuffled it several times before passing them out, one by one. What did you think of operations, Matt? Steve asked after the last card was dealt and the top card had been turned to start the discard pile. Cold, he said between bites. I don't know how you guys do it. We like the freedom, Nick put in. I spent a couple years in Phoenix, like it drove me crazy. I much prefer rural life. Living in a city is a challenge for us, Matt admitted, but it has advantages. I've spent nearly 10 years in large communities, first at school, then in Austin, Jade said. I'm pretty new here, but so far I like it. I love being able to step out the door and shift. I missed being able to shift as often as I wanted. I was terrified if I shifted in my apartment, someone would see or hear me. I had to drive for more than an hour to find somewhere I felt safe running. Didn't the local clan have somewhere you could shift? Nick asked. They probably did, but I didn't have much to do with them. They were friendly enough and they invited me to join, but I wasn't interested. I wanted to be left alone and for the most part, they let me have my way. Nick looked at her, and Steve knew he was shocked the clan leader in Austin had let her live on her own, without at least checking in with her regularly. It wasn't something he would allow, but then, life around here was a lot different from in a city, any city. The clan had a few single women who lived alone. He had no problem with that, but he made sure they were checked on regularly. It wasn't that he worried they would do anything, more to make sure they were safe and didn't need anything. It was just how he was. "What if you needed something?" Steve asked. "What could I need that I couldn't get myself?" she countered. "Medical help, the touch of another shifter," he suggested. "I didn't have much need for medical care. When I did, I managed on my own. As for touching another kitsune, I've avoided touching people, anyone, for years." Steve's brow furrowed as he frowned. This was important. "Why?" He hoped she would answer. "Because the touch of any man not related to me hurts." Steve's scowl deepened. Matt frowned. "What? How long has this been going on?" "Years." "How many years, Jade?" Steve asked, trying to keep his voice calm. He didn't want her to hear how badly he needed to know. She was quiet a moment, and Steve wasn't sure if she would answer, but finally, in a soft voice, she spoke. "Almost 6. "You've avoided touching people for almost 6 years because it hurts?" Rebecca asked, clearly astonished. "Hurts how?" Jade looked down at her cards, then at her lap, as if avoiding looking at anyone. "It makes my skin burn." "You shook my hand when you first got to town," Nick said. "I smelled your pain, but I didn't think I was the one causing it. Sometimes I just have to deal with it. I've learned not to let it show." "You touch me all the time." Steve looked at her. He knew his confusion was clear on his face. "You don't hurt me," she met his look. "That's why you're determined to see if we can make it work." New understanding dawned across his face. "That's part of it." She looked down again. Steve reached out and lifted her chin with one finger. "Don't look away from me. I like your spirit. I love that you stand up to me and not let me tell you what to do, simply because I'm the Shaku. Just because you're in charge of security around here is no reason for you to boss me around," she shot back, some of the spark returning to her eyes. "I'm curious," Rebecca interrupted. "Have you let anyone but Steve touch you since you got here? Since you started spending time with him?" Jade looked at her a moment as if surprised by the idea. "I don't think so. It's become a habit to avoid being touched. It usually takes conscious effort to let it happen. I have a theory, but you'd have to let Nick touch you to test it. Do you mind?" "I don't think so," Steve protested, not giving her a chance to answer. "Why not?" Jade looked at him, her eyes wide. "You just said it hurts when someone touches you. You're not gonna to do it on purpose." Jade rolled her eyes. "It's not that bad. Besides, I'd like to see if anything's changed and what her theory is." She reached one arm across the table in front of her friend. "Go for it, sir." "What did I tell you about that Sir Crab?" Nick said, his voice stern as he stretched his arm out and laid his hand on hers for a few seconds, then pulled back. "Well?" "It hurt, but not like before." She drew her arm back, her brow creased with confusion. "It's not as strong as it was." She turned to Rebecca. "What's your theory?" "I think it may be some kind of severe skin hunger, triggered by a traumatic event. If you think back, I'll bet it started after something happened. I won't ask what it was. But it's gotten worse the longer it's gone on. Am I right?" Jade looked at the table again, then her gaze flicked to Matt for a second before back to Rebecca. "About something happening and this starting afterward, yes, but that's all I'm gonna say. I'm not asking you to tell us your secrets, I'm just trying to help you. I think the more you're around Steve, or possibly any potential mate, the more contact you have with him, the better it will get, but honestly, I don't think it will completely fade until after you've sealed a mating. Jade frowned. You really think so? Have you seen something like this before? Not exactly like it, but I saw something similar in my old Chanet. They didn't care about mating or potential mates. It was common for parents to arrange marriages for their own benefit. It's why I left. Jade looked like she wanted to ask something but stopped herself. She glanced around the table. Enough about me, let's play? In a minute, Matt said, speaking for the first time since early in the discussion. You said this has been going on for 6 years. Do Mom and Dad know? No. It's my problem, and I didn't want to trouble them. There's no need for you to tell them either. She shot him a menacing look, and Steve had no doubt that if he did, she'd find him and make him pay. He held both hands up in front of himself. Okay, I was just asking. Now you know. She turned her attention back to the cards in front of her, carefully pretending that being the topic of conversation hadn't bothered her.